A great spin-off or sequel is one that uses its source material as a starting point to carve out a unique identity for itself, while a bad one merely wallows in the original, too afraid to veer too far from what made the source material popular, and ultimately ends up drowning in references as a way to compensate for its lack of originality. Better Call Saul is paradoxically both a good and bad spin off story, and I mean that almost literally, as it often feels like two separate shows are happening at the same time. Having just finished the final season, I'm happy to say that I'm done with the show and expect a public apology from every person I've ever seen say it's as good or better than Breaking Bad. This video will be less structured than my previous two and will serve as more of an unhinged rant than anything else. So, without further ado, allow me to talk your ear off for a spell about how Better Call Saul is the Reddit-ification of Breaking Bad. Firstly, let's get the good praise I have for the show stated and out of the way. The relationship between Jimmy and Kim is very easily the best part of the entire show. It's compelling, interesting, engaging, believable, and overall I found myself very easily invested in it. Jimmy, or Saul, is obviously the main draw of the series, and he does a fantastic job, stealing more or less every scene he's in, and I found myself never tiring of the character. I think the show does a lot to add depth to his character, which was needed for him to carry a full-length series. His relationship with Kim, his brother Chuck, and the day-to-day navigation of his profession as a criminal lawyer did a lot to flesh out his character and made for some very enjoyable viewing. And despite how harsh I'm going to come across in this video, if you liked Breaking Bad, I can be fairly sure Better Call Saul will at least hold your attention till the end of the series. With all of that being said, I hate Lalo Salamanca, I hate Nacho Varga, and I hate everything having to do with Gus and Mike and the cartel. Before we unpack these statements in order of least inflammatory to most, I want to address what exactly I mean by Reddit-ification. I wasn't joking when I said the show is almost literally two shows because, save for a few noteworthy intersecting moments, the show is almost split down the middle between Jimmy, Kim, Chuck, Jimmy's professional life generally, and everything having to do with Gus, Mike, Lalo, the cartel, and Nacho. What I mean by Reddit-ification is instead of organically having exciting, tense, and cool, iconic moments born of good writing, you get the distinct impression that these moments happen in Better Call Saul not because that's what would make sense to happen, but because someone watched Breaking Bad and thought, wouldn't it be cool if this happened? Basically, these moments are thought of first, then the characters contort themselves to make the scene happen, no matter how contrived. This essentially gives the uncanny feeling that one is watching Breaking Bad fanfiction at least half of the time, most exemplified in Lalo, but we'll get there. I hate Nacho Varga. This is probably the least controversial claim, as I can't seriously imagine there are many die-hard Nacho Varga fans out there. Nacho is in contention for the worst character on the show by way of the sheer distilled boredom he induces. Every second he is on screen was a second I wish I could get back. Nothing about his character is even slightly interesting or charming or fun to watch in any way. His storyline was entirely forgettable, and maybe in an ironic sense, his father was a better character despite getting about 1/100th of the screen time. Waste of a character and took away from the stronger parts of the show, not much more to say beyond expressing pure contempt. I hate everything to do with Gus and the cartel and Mike. To clarify, I'm watching a show called Better Call Saul for Saul Goodman, not to watch an entire B-plot revolve around Gus and Mike's wacky misadventures with the cartel. This is the part of the show that really does nothing but wallow in Breaking Bad's massive shadow, bringing nothing very new or interesting to the characters, and, quite frankly, they overstay their welcome very early on. Speaking of overstaying their welcome, the cousins make a return in this show, because of course they do, and they are just as tired and boring as they were in Breaking Bad, and somehow even more cringe. They devolve into fanfiction tier characters, and I use the term characters in massive quotations, around the time they clear an entire gang hideout in a way that I'm sure made people on Reddit and Twitter cream themselves from knee to toe. In fact, the more screen time we get of Mike, and particularly Gustavo, the nagging feeling of fanfiction becomes harder to ignore. The feeling culminates in Gus's final confrontation with Lalo Salamanca, a scene which holds zero weight because we, as the viewer, know Gus can't die, but we'll get more into that later in the video. The key point I want to drive home is that basically everything having to do with Nacho and Mike and Gus and the cartel feels needlessly tacked on to an otherwise great story. The only possible explanation for their inclusion strikes me as an insecurity the show has about its main concept, saying, this can't stand on its own merits, maybe if we throw in these things that were popular in Breaking Bad, the show will be just as good. Having allusions to the source material isn't a bad thing in and of itself, but the show uses them as a crutch in both style and substance. I say insecurity because, at least in my opinion, the strongest parts of the show have nothing to do with any of that, yet the show feels pigeonholed to include them for fear of trying something new and people not liking it. Remember Gus? Remember Mike? Remember the cartel? Remember the meth lab? Remember the cousins? Remember Jesse Pinkman? Remember Breaking Bad? The show seems to say, as we, the audience, are expected to all collectively soyjack and scream, I remember. The full weight of my annoyance with the show, the central thrust of my criticisms, can really be exemplified through one character, Lalo Salamanca. In so many words, Lalo Salamanca is what you would get if you asked a Redditor to write a captivating, complex villain. How this basically cashes out is in whatever the villain equivalent of a Gary Stu is, while being about as captivating as a Far Cry villain. He is somehow infinitely resourceful as well as extremely lucky in all situations he finds himself in, equipped with a personality that confuses psychopathic disregard for human life with an interesting character trait. He's quirky and quippy in a way that makes me cringe out of my skull. The nicest thing I can say about the character is that the actor who plays him is decently cast, but that doesn't do a whole lot when you hate the character. It baffles me how people who claim to be fans of Breaking Bad say they like this villain. Gus killing Victor with a box cutter made him 10,000 times more intimidating and intense than every kill Lalo made throughout the series combined. I'll end this rant by going a bit in depth on an earlier observation. Much of the show's biggest moments that involve these characters feel extremely unearned at best and manipulative at worst, and I think this can in part be blamed on the writing constraints that naturally come from a prequel. Certain things just can't happen, even if they make sense, because Breaking Bad has to happen. Nacho can't kill Don Juan, Lalo can't kill Gus, Mike can't be killed by the cops, yet for some reason the show is constantly putting these characters in a false sense of danger, which results in actions that don't make sense and scenes that feel self-indulgent. Using Gus and Lalo's final interaction as an example, there are ample opportunities for Lalo to safely kill Gus even while recording his dumb video, and realistically, there is no way Gus should have survived that encounter. So the show contorts itself into still having this no-win situation while ensuring Gus lives and Lalo dies. Instead, the scene functions more as a vehicle to show how badass Gus is to the audience and finally killing off what has to be the luckiest man on the planet. And that really is peak Reddit, isn't it? Disregard what makes sense narratively so long as I can have my cool, badass character show how badass and cool they are to the audience. And hey, looking at the general consensus online, I guess it worked. Reddit won. We live in a hell world.